You are 7 years old, playing barefoot on the dusty path outside your family's cottage in a Christian village deep in the Balkan hills. The air smells faintly of baking bread from your mother's hearth. The sound of goats bleating drifts lazily from the fields. It is an ordinary day until it isn't. A shadow falls across the threshold. Men in layered silk coats, armed and mounted, appear as though conjured from thin air. Their boots are polished to a mirror shine, their horses restless under the weight of ornate saddles. At first, you think they are passing through, but they stop. One dismounts, unrolling a scroll whose edges are worn from use. His eyes scan it, then fix on your family's doorway. They have not come for taxes. They have not come for grain, or livestock, or news from the capital. They have come for you. You feel your mother's fingers tighten around your shoulder, hear her voice crack into a pitch you've never heard before. The man in silk speaks with the cold detachment of someone reading from a list, reciting your father's name, your age, and the fact that your village's time has come. His words are final. There is no bargaining, no appeal. This was the Ottoman Empire, a vast machine that for over 6 centuries spread across 3 continents, swallowing cities, mountains, and rivers into its dominion. It was a civilization of contradictions, magnificent mosques and glittering palaces on one side, iron chains and blood taxes on the other. It commanded armies whose discipline could break empires, yet its power was built as much on silks and shadows as on steel and cannon. We remember the Ottomans for their dazzling architecture, the domes and minarets that still pierce the skies of Istanbul. We remember the sultans whose courts hummed with music and poetry, whose naval fleets turned seas into Ottoman lakes. But this brilliance was built atop human suffering so carefully concealed that even today much of it remains hidden in dusty archives and whispered oral histories. Behind the carved stone walls and gold-leaf ceilings of imperial palaces lay systems of sexual control and exploitation so meticulously organized that they could rival any military campaign in complexity. They were not accidents of war or rare abuses of power, they were policies, codified and maintained over centuries. Policies that turned human intimacy into an instrument of rule, and the human body into a ledger entry in the empire's balance sheet. The records are still there, in Ottoman Turkish script, in Italian dispatches, in Greek village chronicles, and in the notes of travelers who passed through the empire's bustling cities. They speak of practices that weaponized childhood, rewrote identities, and transformed captives into tools of the state. And among them, one stands apart as perhaps the most psychologically devastating, the Devshirme, the child levy or blood tax. Every few years, imperial officials would sweep through the Christian villages of the Balkans and Anatolia in what was officially called collecting. They carried not weapons, but registers detailed inventories of every Christian household, every boy of suitable age, every previous year of compliance. It was a system of memory and mathematics. When your village had last given up its sons, how many remained, and how many the state now required. They were not looking for men already set in their ways, nor boys too young to be of immediate use. Their preference was for the tender age old enough to learn obedience, young enough to forget their past. Sometimes this meant boys of 12 or 13. Sometimes, chillingly, it meant boys barely able to walk. In one Venetian ambassador's report from the 16th century, there is an account of a mother clutching her 4-year-old as officials pried him away, her screams echoing through the valley until her voice broke. To the empire, these were not children, they were raw material, potential soldiers, servants, courtiers or worse. In the ledgers of the Sublime Porte, they appeared as numbers, their names and families erased almost immediately. To the parents, however, they were a part of themselves being torn away, a piece of their future severed forever. And here is where the cruelty deepened. The Devshirme was not simply about manpower. It was about transformation, turning Christian children into instruments of the Muslim Empire through a process so complete that within a year many could no longer remember the language of their birth. They were forbidden to speak it, forbidden to mention their former homes, forbidden to cling to anything that tied them to who they once were. For the officials, this erasure was not an unfortunate side effect, it was the goal. A boy without a past could be molded into anything: a soldier who would kill without hesitation, a courtier who would serve without question, a body that could be claimed without guilt because it no longer belonged to the boy himself. Some would go to the empire's most feared and disciplined military unit, the Janissaries. Others would be taken down a different, far more secretive path. But whether they marched in formation or walked the polished marble halls of the Sultan's palace, they all began here on days like this, when a knock at the door shattered a family and pulled another thread into the Ottoman net. In the coming moments, as your mother's wailing grows hoarse and the hoof beats fade into the distance, you do not know that you have been entered into the empire's living inventory. You do not know that in the eyes of your new masters, you are no longer a son, no longer even Christian. You are an asset, and the process of remaking you has already begun. The men who take you are not acting on impulse. Every movement is deliberate, every order pre-approved. You are part of a carefully orchestrated operation designed to keep the Ottoman state fed with a steady supply of human capital. This was not a raid in the way bandits pillage a village, it was an official harvest, repeated every few years with the precision of a clock. Before the caravan even reached your home, the officials already knew your name. They knew how many boys lived in your village, their approximate ages, and even details about their physical health, gathered through networks of spies, local informants, and compliant village leaders. Some of these details came from priests or elders coerced into compliance under threat of heavy taxation or violent reprisals. The scribes carried large ledgers bound in leather, the pages filled with neat Ottoman Turkish script. They recorded your age, height, complexion, and any distinctive features. In their eyes, these were not sentimental details, but practical data points, information that would determine where in the empire's machinery you might fit. A tall boy with strong limbs might be earmarked for the Janissary corps. A boy with striking beauty might be set aside for palace service. Even the journey to Constantinople was part of the conditioning. The officials split boys into small groups, mixing those from different regions so that no two spoke the same dialect. The intent was simple: isolation. If you could not speak to the boy beside you in your own language, you could not conspire, reminisce, or comfort one another. Silence became a second prison, more suffocating than the chains on your wrists. This was the genius and the cruelty of the Devshirme. It was not only about taking bodies, but about dismantling identities before they could even take root. Ottoman administrators understood what modern psychologists have since confirmed, that language and memory are bound together. Remove the tongue, and the past begins to fade. For some, the separation from home was so traumatic that they refused to eat, wasting away on the road. Others were beaten for speaking their native tongue, the blows serving as both punishment and lesson. In rare cases, a boy would attempt escape, but the punishments were swift and public, meant to break the spirit of all who witnessed it. When they finally arrived in the capital or at designated training centers, the process of remolding began in earnest. Baptismal names were stripped away like dirty clothes and replaced with Muslim ones, names chosen not by the boys, but assigned by their new masters. Circumcision ceremonies followed quickly, both as a religious marker and a public declaration that the boy no longer belonged to his old faith. Training was relentless. Mornings began before dawn with prayers and physical drills. Afternoons were spent learning Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They memorized passages from the Quran, studied the empire's laws, and practiced obedience as though it were a martial art. The brightest and most physically gifted advanced fastest, but advancement was not always a reward. For some, it meant a path to the Janissary barracks, a fate that sounded glorious to outsiders, but came with its own chains. Those not chosen for military life might be placed in domestic service, working in the palaces of governors or in the vast complexes of Istanbul. But even here, the path was not free from danger. Certain boys caught the attention of court officials for reasons that had nothing to do with skill in arms or intelligence. Beauty was its own currency in the Ottoman system, and the ledgers that recorded your height and build could just as easily be read as an inventory of the empire's human adornments. And so, the Devshirme was not merely a manpower policy, it was a sorting mechanism. It sorted the empire's captives into streams: soldier, servant, or something far more intimate. Every choice, every record, every seemingly benign piece of data was another gear in a vast machine designed to convert foreign children into Ottoman instruments. By the time a boy had completed his first year within the system, he would look in the mirror, if he was allowed one, and struggle to recall the face of the child who once played in the dust outside his home. His language was slipping, his memories growing faint, replaced by the empire's words, the empire's prayers, the empire's will. It was in this crucible that the Janissary course found its recruits, men who had been broken down to the foundation and rebuilt, not only to fight for the Sultan, but to love him as their sole master. What began as a child's abduction would end in total devotion to the empire that had stolen him. In the next part, we will step into the barracks of these elite soldiers, not just to see their drills or hear their oaths, but to understand the unspoken rules that governed their most private bonds, and how even intimacy itself became a weapon in the Ottoman arsenal. The Janissary Corps was the pride of the Ottoman military machine, an elite fighting force whose loyalty to the Sultan was meant to be absolute. From the outside, they appeared as a brotherhood forged in discipline and valor, the embodiment of military honor. But behind the polished armor and the perfectly synchronized marches lay a world where loyalty was maintained not only through training and indoctrination, but through the careful shaping of personal bonds. The boys taken through the Devshirme, who were deemed physically strong, disciplined, and intelligent enough, were sent to Janissary training barracks. Here, they were immersed in a regimen that left little room for anything except the service of the Sultan. Life was stripped down to repetition drills at dawn, weapons practice under the unblinking gaze of officers, religious instruction woven seamlessly into every hour. But there was one rule that outsiders often misunderstood: Janissaries were forbidden to marry or have families during their service. This wasn't simply to keep them focused on the battlefield. The real purpose was more insidious. Without wives, children, or property, the only bonds they could form were with each other and with the Sultan. Their entire sense of belonging, affection, and even intimacy was contained within the military unit. From this isolation grew an institutionalized culture of homoerotic relationships. While not all Janissaries engaged in them, the empire recognized these bonds and, rather than suppressing them, channeled them into a system of control. The most striking example of this was the Kikavuk Battalion, a unit specifically tasked with managing and regulating intimate relationships between soldiers. This was no informal arrangement. It had a defined command structure, set rules, and an acknowledged role within the corps. The idea was pragmatic. If the empire could control the personal relationships of its soldiers, it could also control their loyalty, morale, and cohesion. The men in this battalion occupied privileged positions, granted access to resources and opportunities for advancement in exchange for serving the personal needs of higher-ranking officers. Historical records from foreign envoys and Ottoman chroniclers describe how some young recruits, often the most handsome and charismatic, were informally sponsored by senior officers. In return for companionship and submission, they could expect protection, better equipment, and favorable postings. This was loyalty purchased through the currency of the body. In such an environment, military hierarchy and sexual hierarchy became intertwined. A soldier's rise through the ranks could depend not only on his skill with a sword, but on his willingness to enter into and maintain such relationships. For the empire, this was an efficient system. It kept desires contained within the unit, prevented soldiers from forming outside attachments that might weaken their allegiance, and ensured that their emotional lives revolved entirely around the corps and, by extension, the Sultan. It was a far cry from the romanticized image of a warrior bound only to honor and nation. In truth, these men were bound to each other in ways that blurred the line between brotherhood and possession. And while some of these bonds may have been genuine, others were born of necessity, coercion, or the desire to survive in a system where intimacy could be as much a weapon as a sword. Not all boys taken in the Devshirme system were destined for the barracks. The most beautiful, those whose features caught the eye of selecting officers, were diverted to a different path entirely, one that led not to the battlefield, but to the polished marble corridors of the Sultan's private quarters. Their training, too, would be rigorous, but its purpose would have nothing to do with war. And for them, the dangers ahead would be of a different kind, dangers that cut deeper than any blade. For some boys, the inspection at the village was just the first of many evaluations. Those who were considered too beautiful for the Janissary barrack, skin unblemished, features symmetrical, eyes that drew attention, were marked for a different destiny. They would not be drilled in the clash of spears or the handling of muskets. Their battlefield would be the palace itself. The journey for these boys often ended in the gilded gates of Topkapi Palace or other imperial residences. From the outside, these places gleamed like the heart of civilization, with their tiled courtyards, perfumed gardens, and fountains that sang over marble basins. But for the boys brought here, this beauty masked a reality more dangerous than the Janissaries' sword. Their first transformation was religious. Just as with the soldiers, their Christian names were stripped away and replaced with Muslim ones. Conversion was swift and public, reinforced through rituals that severed them from their former faith. Then came the grooming, literally and figuratively. Their hair was styled, their posture corrected, their clothing tailored to accentuate their youth and grace. Every aspect of their appearance was controlled. Some of these boys were assigned as pages or personal attendants to members of the court. But the most coveted and feared position was service in the Sultan's inner quarters. Here, proximity to the ruler could bring immense influence, but it also meant complete vulnerability. The most dangerous transformation of all, however, was the one that ensured they would never escape the palace hierarchy: castration. The Ottoman Empire did not practice castration within its own borders, at least not officially, as Islamic law forbade it. Instead, boys destined for eunuch service were often sent to castration centers in Egypt, Sudan, or Ethiopia, where Christians or Jews outside the jurisdiction of Islamic law performed the operation. The mortality rate was staggering. Historical records and European diplomatic accounts suggest that only 1 in 10 boys survived the procedure. Imagine the arithmetic of that cruelty. If the palace required 100 eunuchs, the empire was prepared to mutilate 1,000 children, watching 900 die in agony, just to acquire the survivors. Survivors were divided into 2 main categories: African boys, often captured or purchased in the Horn of Africa, typically underwent complete removal of both penis and testicles, becoming Karaaka's black eunuchs. They were considered more trustworthy around the women of the harem and often rose to positions of enormous administrative power, overseeing palace security, finances, and even political correspondence. European boys, usually from the Balkans, underwent partial castration, losing only their testicles. These Aka's white eunuchs were more often placed in administrative or ceremonial roles, serving as intermediaries between the inner palace and the outside world. The psychological damage was beyond calculation. These boys were denied not only the ability to father children, but any possibility of normal sexual intimacy. In the eyes of the empire, this was not a tragedy but a feature. A eunuch could be utterly devoted to the palace because the palace had taken from him any hope of a life outside its walls. Yet within the rigid hierarchy of the court, some eunuchs did acquire influence, power enough to make or break political careers, whisper into the Sultan's ear, and shape imperial decisions. But their power was never truly their own. It was always tied to the system that had first destroyed them. Those who were not made eunuchs, but still possessed the beauty sought by the court, might find themselves trained as caciques, male dancers, dressed in elaborate women-esque garments, whose performances entertained the highest ranks of Ottoman society. On the surface, their art was one of music and movement. Beneath it, It was a theater of possession, where bodies were currency and performance was consent that could not be withdrawn. For these boys, the palace was not a place of refuge or privilege. It was a stage where every movement, every glance, and every breath belonged to someone else. And as the music played in the great halls, another, darker stage was being prepared, one where the line between performance and exploitation vanished entirely. The Kekik dancers were a paradox in silk. To the Ottoman elite, they were entertainers, symbols of refinement, masters of music and movement. To the boys themselves, they were prisoners in costumes, paraded as curiosities for a crowd that saw them as both spectacle and prey. Their training began young. Selected for their beauty and grace, they were taught not only to dance, but to embody a deliberate illusion. They wore long, flowing skirts and embroidered bodices modeled after women's clothing, their hair grown long and perfumed. Anklets chimed in rhythm with the drums, and kohl rimmed their eyes until they glistened under the torchlight. The effect was intoxicating to the audiences who gathered in the palaces and private mansions to watch them. But these performances were not mere art. The Kekiks existed in a dangerous space between genders, neither fully male nor female in the public imagination. This ambiguity was part of the allure for their audiences, who could project fantasies without the constraints of Ottoman gender norms. Crowds gathered in opulent halls, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the scent of rose water. Musicians struck the first beats on their davul drums, the flutes wailing high above them. The dancers entered in lines, hips swaying, hands tracing languid arcs in the air. The room's attention sharpened into a single hunger. Historical accounts, especially from European travelers, shocked by what they witnessed, speak of the audience's behavior turning violent. Men jostled and shouted, intoxicated both by drink and by the sight before them. Fights broke out over which man would get the dancers' attention afterward. Some accounts describe glassware shattering, daggers drawn, even blood spilled, all for the chance to possess a single boy for the night. There was no real barrier between the dancer and his admirers. If a man in the audience reached out, the boy was expected to accept his touch. If he demanded more, refusal was dangerous, sometimes fatal. The dancers were under no legal protection, they were property. Their bodies were treated as public entertainment, both on and off the stage. This was not a fringe practice. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, Kekik troops were in high demand across the empire, hired for weddings, circumcision feasts, and court celebrations. Poets wrote verses about their beauty. Painters immortalized them in miniatures. Their image was romanticized in art even as their reality was brutalized in life. Over time, the violence and chaos surrounding Kekik performances became too public to ignore. Drunken brawls sometimes ended in death. Political factions used the dancers as pawns in court rivalries. Eventually, reforms in the 19th century under Sultan Mahmud II led to the suppression of the practice, framed as a moral purification of the empire. But by then, generations of boys had been fed into the system, their lives consumed on stages where music masked cruelty. Yet even the end of the Kekik tradition did not end the exploitation of boys in the Ottoman palace. Behind closed doors, a smaller, even more secretive system endured, one that left no art, no music, no poetry to disguise its intent. It was called the Tavşanoğlan, the bunny boys. If the Kekik dancers lived their exploitation in the open, the Tavşanoğlan existed in the empire's shadows. Their name, bunny boys, sounds almost harmless, a euphemism that might suggest playfulness or charm. In truth, it concealed one of the most secretive and predatory systems in the Ottoman palace. Unlike the child levee or the public performances, this practice left almost no official record. The boys chosen for this fate were not registered as palace staff, nor were they given positions in the Janissary corps. They existed outside of the legal framework, entirely ghosts in the imperial machine. This was deliberate. By denying them any official status, the empire ensured they had no recourse, no protections, no traceable history. Most were taken from Christian families in Greece, the Balkans, or the Caucasus regions the empire knew well for producing boys whose features matched the tastes of certain courtiers. The selection process was discreet. Instead of public inspections, scouts and agents made quiet arrangements with local officials or directly with families desperate to avoid harsher penalties. Sometimes they were simply stolen, disappearing without a word to their parents. The boys were housed in isolated chambers deep within the palace complex, away from the eyes of regular staff. Their world was narrow, polished stone floors, heavy silk draperies, the occasional glint of candle light on brass fixtures. Guards controlled every movement, and their only visitors were the high-ranking officials who had the power to summon them. In these private encounters, the boys' purpose was singular sexual gratification for the men who held them. There were no duties of service, no skills to be learned, no possibility of upward mobility. They were not pages who might someday become administrators, nor dancers who could perform for other patrons. They were possessions, existing for one use only. The competition was relentless, and it was by design. Palace officials deliberately pitted women against one another to prevent unity. Every interaction could be a test. Friendships were rare, alliances temporary. Informants moved silently through the halls, their loyalty purchased with the promise of advancement or protection. The pressure to distinguish oneself often led to acts of calculated cruelty. Women might sabotage a rival's garments before a royal appearance, poison her food, or spread rumors about her conduct. Failure to impress could mean reassignment to menial labor or worse, banishment from the harem altogether. Stripped of fine clothing and cast into the streets of Constantinople with nothing. But the most chilling fate was reserved for the children born within those walls. While the sons of favored consorts might one day rise to political power, many children, especially those born to African mothers, never saw the light of day. Infanticide was quietly woven into the system, a grim tool to maintain racial hierarchies and prevent undesirable bloodlines from complicating the imperial succession. Contemporary European visitors often remarked on the absence of mixed-race children in a city that housed thousands of African women in sexual relationships with Ottoman men. The only explanation was that these children were being systematically eliminated. The women who survived long enough to age out of desirability faced another form of erasure. Without pensions, without property, and without the right to marry without permission, many were sold to brothels, sent into forced marriages with low-ranking officials, or simply discarded. Years of palace life had left them with no trade, no family ties, and no protection. Inside the harem, even luxury was a weapon. The silks, the jewels, the perfumes, all were part of a system that dressed captivity in beauty, making obedience feel like privilege. The architecture itself reinforced this control. Walls that blocked sight lines, corridors that curved to confuse, doors that locked from the outside. And while the outside world imagined the harem as a place of soft pleasures, its reality was closer to a battlefield, one fought with whispers, glances, and poisoned cups, under the watchful eyes of eunuchs, whose own survival depended on keeping the women divided. Yet, as brutal as the life inside the harem could be, there was another arena where the empire's cruelty became even more public. It was a stage not of silk and song, but of rope, blade, and spectacle, a theater where sexual violence was put on display for all to see. In the streets and squares of the Ottoman Empire, punishment was never just about law, it was about performance. Executions were public events, meant not only to eliminate offenders, but to send a message, to etch fear into the memory of every witness. And when the crime touched upon sexuality, the spectacle became something darker, more intimate in its cruelty. Convicts accused of sexual offenses were often punished in ways that mirrored their alleged crimes. This was not justice as we understand it today, it was theater, calculated to humiliate before it killed. In the case of sexual crimes, the degradation was as much the point as the execution itself. Crowds gathered in public squares, drawn by both morbid curiosity and the tacit encouragement of the authorities. The executioners were masters of staging. They knew how to pace the ordeal, how to stretch a moment until the crowd leaned forward in unison, hungry for the next act. Punishments were elaborate, and their design reflected an unsettling blend of judicial procedure and performance art. Witnesses described prisoners stripped naked before the crowd, bound in ways that exposed them to jeers and lewd gestures. Sometimes implements of torture were chosen specifically to mutilate the genitals, ensuring the victim's sexual identity was destroyed before death. Rope, heated metal, and blades were tools not only of execution, but of narrative, telling the onlookers that sexual deviance would be answered with sexual obliteration. These executions were not solemn affairs, they were festivals of violence. Spectators shouted suggestions to the executioners, placed wagers on how long the victim might survive, and laughed at their suffering. Street vendors sold food to the gathered throngs. The boundary between justice and entertainment dissolved entirely. The Ottoman legal system regulated this violence. Far from being spontaneous acts of cruelty, these punishments were codified in law and carried out under official sanction. Judges could prescribe the method, the duration, and even the order of mutilations. The goal was not merely to kill, but to make the death serve as a lasting memory, a cautionary tale carved into the collective mind of the empire. Archaeological excavations in former execution sites have uncovered remains that bear these marks: pelvic bones scored by blades, skulls shattered in ways that indicate prolonged torture, burn marks consistent with heated instruments. The evidence confirms what the written records suggest, that these punishments were deliberately drawn out, designed to maximize suffering before the final blow. For children growing up in such an environment, violence was not an aberration, it was part of the social landscape. They saw human beings displayed like broken dolls, their bodies turned into warnings, and when those same children heard the sound of a distant caravan of Ottoman officials coming to collect the blood tax, they understood all too well the stakes of being taken. The normalization of sexual violence was not confined to the courts or the gallows. It permeated the family home. Parents, desperate to protect their children from the gaze of collectors or the appetites of the powerful, resorted to acts of self-mutilation, scarring their children's faces, breaking teeth, even crippling limbs to render them less desirable. It was an act of love twisted into cruelty, proof of how thoroughly fear could warp the human instinct to protect. And through it all, the empire profited. The slave markets thrived, the harems replenished, the palaces gleamed. Sexual exploitation was not a side effect of Ottoman governance, it was part of its economic and political foundation, woven into the very fabric of the state. But the machinery of this exploitation did not vanish when the empire began to crumble. Its structures, habits, and scars outlived the sultans, seeping into the post-Ottoman world in ways both visible and unseen. By the time the Ottoman Empire staggered into its final century, the machinery of sexual exploitation had been in motion for generations. It was as much a part of the imperial structure as the army or the treasury. The slave trade, the harems, the Devshirme, the secret chambers of the Tavşanoğlan, these were not fringe abuses, but pillars of a system that had learned to turn human bodies into political capital and economic profit. The empire's bureaucrats left behind a paper trail that makes the scale undeniable. In dusty archives across Istanbul, one can still find ledgers meticulously listing the names, or more often, the physical descriptions of enslaved people, their origins, their ages, and the prices they fetched. Inventories of harem women read like livestock records, noting skin tone, hair texture, and temperament. Correspondence between provincial governors and court officials discussed not just tax shipments or troop movements, but the suitability of captives for palace service. What is perhaps most striking is the tone of these records. There is no indication of shame, no attempt to obscure what was being done. The language is clinical, transactional. To those who created them, these were not crimes, they were simply administration. Foreign powers knew. Ambassadors from Venice, France, and Britain sent home detailed reports of the sexual systems they witnessed or heard about. But the moral outrage was muted, tempered by diplomatic priorities and commercial interests. Trade routes through Ottoman lands were too valuable to risk for the sake of distant captives. In some cases, European courts were complicit, purchasing enslaved women themselves or imitating Ottoman practices in their own colonies. Even as the empire weakened in the 19th century, these systems adapted rather than disappeared. The Devshirme faded under international pressure, but the infrastructure for moving human beings across deserts, seas, and borders remained intact. Slavery persisted in other guises, cloaked in contracts or bound in apprenticeships that were little more than indentured servitude. The damage ran deeper than the physical abuses. Over centuries, the normalization of sexual exploitation reshaped cultural attitudes toward gender, intimacy, and power. In many parts of the former empire, the memory of these practices became embedded in folklore, in cautionary tales told to children, in family silences that concealed lost ancestors. In other places, the trauma was less spoken of, but it lived on in inherited mistrust, in fractured identities, in the lingering belief that beauty could be as much a curse as a gift. For the survivors, there was no return to before. A boy taken as a child and molded into a janissary or eunuch could not simply step back into his old life. A woman who had lived in the harem could not reclaim her stolen years. Even those who managed to build new lives carried within them the shadow of what they had endured. And yet, the Ottoman story is not an isolated relic of the past. The systems it perfected, bureaucratic dehumanization, the commodification of intimacy, the intertwining of sexuality and political control, can be traced forward into modern forms of exploitation. The details change, but the structure remains familiar. The last Ottoman Sultan was deposed in 1922 within living memory of people still alive today. This history is closer to us than we might wish to believe. It is not merely a chapter to be read and put aside. It is a warning about how quickly the boundaries of human dignity can be eroded when power decides that people are property. The most horrifying aspect of the Ottoman sexual system was not its brutality, though, that was vast, but its normality. For centuries, it operated in plain sight, integrated into governance, justified by law, and accepted by society. It was a machine that ran smoothly until the day it stopped, leaving millions of broken lives in its wake. To confront it now is to give voice to those silenced for generations. To study it is not to condemn a nation or a faith, but to understand the conditions that allow exploitation to flourish so that we might recognize them should they begin to form again. Because if history teaches us anything, it is that systems of dehumanization are never as far away as they seem. And if we forget the lessons carved into the lives of those who lived and died within the Ottoman machine, we risk building it anew.